So, in this final installment, we are going to be looking at a very short chapter, which is then the creating a little gap. By the way, the image that we have here of the Buddha is due to the fact that today is, according to the Tibetan calendar, the day one commemorates the day when the Buddha returned to Magadha after teaching his mother in the what's called the, what is it again, Tritimsaka heavens, which means the heavens of the 33, where the Buddha's mother had been reborn. So this is really to commemorate this particular event. And let's see here. Yes, so the king of Magadha, I think his name was Bimbisara, when the Buddha alighted back in Magadha, he then received the Buddha with tremendous pomp, and ever since, this particular day has then been commemorated. So when we have these various days throughout the year, we have 4 of them. This is then one of them. So this is a very auspicious day today. So just to go over what we've covered, and this, by the way, is also how all Tibetan traditional classes begin, is usually going over what the ground that we've covered earlier. So we normally go over what's called the structural outline. In this case, I think we're just going to go through the chapters here. I've been trying to give them some sort of a, how do you say, try to establish the logical progression of these chapters. And in doing so, we could say that part 1 of this, of the path is the goal, provides an understanding of ground, path, and fruition. And then in part 2, we started off with an understanding how confusion operates. And part 2, then, chapter 2, is a introduction to the attitudes we would want to have around the practice of meditation. And again, this is not exactly meditation instruction, but it's quite precise in providing a sense of the atmosphere. And chapter 3 is then about the sense of our perceptions. And this is where you could say vipassana kicks in, that we begin to have some sense of freedom from the ordinary, as Trungpa Rinpoche puts it, stage sets. And in exploring that, then we also looked at the experience of boredom, that our ordinary dramas are temporarily put on hold, and we begin to see through the constructs of our dramas in relation to our perceptions of the world, the stage set. And in doing that, we begin to have appreciation for space, where we are, rather than necessarily our relationship to that space, to these phenomena. And this is then the discovery of, let's say, the unconditional quality of luminosity. And again, I'd like to say that even though this is a text that supposedly deals with the foundation of meditation, this of course comes with Trungpa Rinpoche as a master of the great perfection, and as such the perspective that we bring to meditation here, even though it ostensibly is framed within, modestly framed within the foundational context of shamatha and vipassana, it carries so much inspiration from the great perfection and from the Mahamudra traditions. Then last time we presented the notion of discipline and how it relates to awareness, and particularly discipline not as something we impose on ourselves, but rather something where we begin to allow to experience freshness of awareness, that we open the windows and we experience again the world without our clutter, our staleness. And here then the use of the word absent-mindedness denotes this quality of non-interference and a sense of wider perspective, not necessarily us minding what's happening, and this sense, a sense of, in this way, a sense of non-worry and not clinging. So absent-mindedness in that sense. And also in applying that, the notion of mindfulness not as something that we continually come back to in terms of walking around with eggs on our head as something where we are incredibly mindful and serious, but rather drawing on a notion of our heritage, our common DNA shared with the Buddha and with those of the lineage. And in this way, mindfulness not as importing something alien, but rather drawing on what's innate to us. And then finally, the last chapter last time was about loneliness, in the sense that we're not trying to escape, or rather we're not buying into our attempts to cover up our duality, and rather beginning with loneliness there is the discovery of non-duality. And in doing that, the role of the teacher is there as someone who encourages us, and also the Sangha as someone who is there as encouragement. The Sangha as someone that represents enlightenment, and others who likewise on the path are rather not, they don't necessarily represent enlightenment, but rather they somehow represent the teacher. And also they are just like us, individuals who are on the path. So this sense of community. Now, Trungpa Rinpoche at this point says we should possibly here have some idea of what Vipassana means. Again, Vipassana is founded within the context of shamatha practice. We sit, we practice the famous Buddhist conspicuous aspect of Buddhism, which is sitting and being fully present within our physicality relating to our bodiness. We ground ourselves both physically with sitting and also psychologically with the practice of mindfulness, coming back to our breath. But in doing that, we discover some sense of freedom from the normal grip of our self-centered dramas around us and the world. And the point with Vipassana is then that we'd want to integrate this in all aspects of our experience. So to integrate Vipassana in post-meditation is the heart of all Buddhist practice. And Vipassana is not something that belongs to one particular tradition. Vipassana is synonymous with Chan, with Zen, with Dzogchen, with Mahamudra. There's not any Buddhism that is not, you would say, Vipassana. Now, in that we then have this guidance on the practice of Vipassana, we have here been provided with a unique sense of its application. We're very fortunate to have someone like Trungpa Rinpoche who masters the language. And it's important that we recognize that while this instruction is entirely classical Buddhist, even though it's phrased in a very modern context, we really have the full lineage instruction on mindfulness. And it's not a sanitized mindfulness. I say this, of course, speaking from the 21st century perspective. We, probably most of us, are familiar with how mindfulness has been incorporated within the world of corporate management. And it's interesting, recently a friend of mine sent me an article which identifies from within the corporate world how there's a lot lacking in this sanitized version of mindfulness that's being peddled in managerial context. And so much actually is lacking in that, aspects such as, you can say, values, ethics, and so forth. And it's not only about mindfulness serving the purpose of ethics, but it's also that ethics in itself is part of, you could say, perfecting mindfulness. So if there's anybody who's interested, let me know. I'm happy to share that article. I can send it on to you. But what we have here is an experiential approach. So we generally, in a Mahayana context, explain Vipassana very often through Madhyamika, through the Prajnaparamita teachings, and we have in the Mahayana dialectics a great analytical apparatus. And this is, of course, essential for us who live in a multicultural setting, a multicultural discourse, that we have some, you could say, formulation, ways of articulating this perspective for our own sake, and also if we want to communicate this and also make sense of the practice of meditation in a cultural context. So such teachings do exist, and while they were initially formulated within a multicultural India, it was really the teachings on Madhyamika and Prajnaparamita and so forth, with all its dialectical aspects, were actually, interestingly enough, preserved by the Tibetans, even though they had a monoculture of Buddhism in Tibet. But it actually comes very handy for us who, again, live in a multicultural context, that we have actually a scientific rationality that can explain what it is that's going on. So it's important that we don't necessarily shy away from the apparent density of Madhyamika. But if we, anyway, what we have here is all about experience. So Vipassana here is explained in terms of meditation. It is going directly to what is, of course, also the objective of Madhyamika teachings, which is to actually go to what we call settling meditation. So very often in a Madhyamika context we talk about analytical meditation, and that is why Trungpa Rinpoche also would say here we haven't really gone into details with regards to Vipassana. But what we have done here is a more direct approach, which is then called settling meditation, which is then the practical application of the meditation associated with Vipassana and also associated with Madhyamika. Now, what is the message we want to take with us is that, having now studied this and looked at it, the impact of this is only really appreciated and realized through it being applied, not as a technique, but something that is deeply innate to our opening up and relating precisely, fearlessly with the world. If we have such wish to do that and eliminate our alienation to the world, then we're not introducing anything new. We are merely beginning to look with a wider perspective, which is what Vipassana means, and that means also to then apply it in post-meditation. So this is why Trungpa Rinpoche would refer to then post-meditation as being the heart of Buddhist meditation. Also, Jamgon Kongtrul, a great Nyingma Kagyu Master, made a point about how meditation only really is valuable if we can apply it in post-meditation. Anyway, I thought, let's see how we go with time, but I'd like to also this time spend a little bit of time on just actually practicing. Let's see how we go. Now, if we recognize the value of meditation, we need to commit to its actual practice. In doing that, we will have a fresh experience of our emotions, and such an experience, in that it addresses the emotions that very often filters our experience, we bring new life to our world. If we recognize how essential or innate actually the project of meditation is, then it becomes compelling to us to commit to its application, its actual practice. Meditation comes with a whole culture of hype and exists as an exotic, marginal phenomenon that indeed nowadays, as we just mentioned, is more and more becoming mainstream, but it still could remain somewhat elusive, and it, particularly actually within the realm of Buddhists, meditation is something that very often is idealized and approached somewhat cautiously and somewhat neurotically. There seems to be the sense that meditation is something that we believe in, but we're reluctant to do. So it's important that if we now really recognize the value of meditation, that we commit to it and actually do it. Hence it ceases to be something mythological. It becomes something real. It becomes something honest, something very real in terms of what we do in our lives. It becomes very relevant to our experience and our exchange with the world, and of course because it affects our subjectivity, it affects all that we, or it's reflected in all our various happinesses and suffering, and we understand how we could actually be empowered to deal with what is the most important. Really what drives us is our emotions, our, you would say, filtered emotions that then become neurosis. So with meditation, we could begin to see through this hoax of the emotions and what they're based on, the sense of me-ness, which is, together with the sense of me, we have then this ignorant projecting reality onto this dependently arisen shifting conditions of our world. There's nothing solid about our world. It exists exactly due to predictable causes and conditions, and we have the experience continually of ourselves being in the driver's seat. So meditation is acknowledging that and then doing something about it. So if we then would practice meditation, this would transform our existing world into a new world. It's a familiar new world or an old new world when we begin to apply this open mind approach of meditation. So there's a lot of, we'll have some paradoxes here, of course. We've talked of boredom, we've talked of not wanting to achieve anything, but again, back to the expectancy or expecting, as we had it with the case of pregnancy, we can speak of joy as something that will happen. As His Holiness Chögyam Rinpoche would say, on this path it's impossible not to experience clarity, bliss, and non-thought. The joy that we have is not something that's constructed or conjured up or positive thinking. It's just connecting with reality. It's becoming fully present in our lives, and it's something that we can proactively make happen through uniting discipline and awareness. So there's a joy in connecting with reality, which is like connecting with earth. We don't need to import anything. One of my teachers, Trungpa Rinpoche, he would talk about integration of Vipassana, a bit like wearing blue jeans, because blue jeans famously is something that you can wear on all occasions, more or less, so it's very versatile. So this Vipassana is something that we can, with great advantage, have with us everywhere. In doing so, we are fully present. There's no deception. There's not needing to deceive or fool or kid anyone. And we don't need to be cheered up. We don't need to have this, I'm tired, and so I can't handle it, and all of that. Meditation is something that gives energy. It cheers us up. It's what we want to do at the end of a hard day's work. So, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, once we have that experience, it is the beginning of basic sanity. We have a mutual stimulating dynamic between discipline and awareness. We experience awareness through discipline, and as we then experience awareness, we are inspired to pursue discipline. So there's this mutual exchange then between these two. There's a living process. And this also means that we are on the path to enlightenment. Now, again, we're not living in a, how do you say, we're not importing something foreign, really, even though you can, obviously Buddhism comes from an Asian culture, but we have met, and even if we haven't met living teachers, I think everybody's familiar with the face of the Dalai Lama on television, and there is a lot of possibilities of encountering authentic teachers, either through media or also in person. If you haven't met any Buddhist teachers, I would recommend doing that. And as you can probably see, what we're dealing with here is this living culture of awakening. And the teacher is very important within that. And also the culture around the Sangha, the living culture of the teacher, having a sense of belonging to this Sangha, to this lineage, is very important. We don't really connect with the teaching, the guru, the Sangha, because we want to be accepted and have a club where we can be appreciated or have a certificate from, so forth, like we spoke about last time. It's more, it is something that provokes us, and we talked last time about the painful aspect of the whole experience with our teacher, with the Sangha and so forth. Not so much intrinsically painful, but more, you could say, growing pains. And the outcome of this, the implication is living with this heritage of our lineage, and as a result our lives become full, very large, wide open, spacious, very inspired. As we practice, then awareness becomes something that is key to whatever we're doing. It is the living Dharma within us, and it is something that short-circuits and interrupts this chain of karmic events that we habitually are imprisoned by. We very often have this notion that this is how we do things, and we don't even question it. Yesterday I was just chatting with some friends about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and in there someone might have come across some of the teachings there where you have a bright light and you have a dull light. And what we'd want to do with awareness is familiarize ourselves with the bright light, not go for the dull light, which is then the light or the attraction to our habitual patterns, where we, of course, might feel at home, a bit like in a cocoon, but this is really where we are imprisoned. So awareness is something that stops that. We can't stop samsara immediately, but samsara is something that continually inspires us in that we experience suffering, we recognize that we can do something about it, so samsara becomes actually an inspiration for wanting freedom, enlightenment. So in that way we don't need to resent samsara or regret samsara. Now we've spoken here about awareness, but it's also important that awareness is not the one-shot deal. You know, we just need to be aware, that's it. And that's also something that we sometimes see, not just in, you could say, corporate mindfulness, but also among Buddhists. So it's not like some absolute source of hope, some as Trungpa Rinpoche says, it's not an absolute source of hope in the evangelical sense. Just be aware and everything's going to be all right. But awareness is a very important part of the journey. And this is because it's something real and honest. And it becomes the core of what we do. It informs our ethics. It informs so many things that we do. And so it is something that is very important. Buddhists everywhere, they are, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, they're practicing it relatively accurately. So everybody is somehow engaged in meditation and awareness, and maybe we're not practicing it perfectly, but still it qualifies as the path. And it's thanks to awareness that our Buddhist or spiritual path becomes something that is authentic. It is because it does something more than just provide comfort. It actually enables us to break through and eliminate obscurations and habitual patterns, and it enables us to connect us with what is real. It inspires wisdom. It inspires what we call prajna. And with that awareness of intelligence happening, there is some sense of joy, some sense of seeing things clearly. And again, this is not on the terms of our expectations, but it is rather a sense of lightness and fullness. So that's the end of this chapter, where the title, creating a gap, creating a little gap, I would say refers to the fact that awareness and honesty and truth is something that we could cultivate, but it's also something that we can experience in our world. So we have this transparency where we can begin to experience the qualities. So these qualities of enlightenment. So this entrance that we begin to forge or open up, we don't necessarily need to break open the complete enlightenment right away, but just beginning to have some gaps begins to make it very real. Then again, we have some great questions, and what you have here is just my summary. One question is about how boredom and joy comes together, and a few of the things that Trungpa Rinpoche says in his answer is that making friends with boredom is the joy. The confidence we have in, you could say, unconditional confidence we have that's not based on us being pleased or gratified, provides this unconditional confidence which is joyful. And also he says boredom is openness, and this is also what joy is, that we are comfortable with what is. Then there's a really good one, which I think everyone would appreciate. The question is, are love relationships just an illusion? And Trungpa Rinpoche answers, for one, he says, this thing about saying just an illusion, the thing is we are in samsara, so everything is an illusion, so we can't really just poo-poo it and say just illusion. Of course, enlightenment is about breaking through the hopes of this illusion, but we are very much caught within illusion, so it's not necessarily something to be looked down upon, and we presently need to make, or you would say, make the illusion work for us, turn it into skillful means for enlightenment, and that's where having a relationship very often can be very much part of our journey. So I would warmly recommend reading. It's quite an extensive answer Trungpa Rinpoche gives, so I'd really like to recommend that. It's excellent for anyone in a relationship or considering having one or having had relationships also. It puts things into perspective. And then there's a question about the relationship between committing to meditation and also the commitment we have as taking the refuge. And again, there's an extensive answer I'd recommend, but no, it's not that extensive actually. But it's succinct, but it's very good. Anyway, basically, Trungpa Rinpoche says that when we take refuge is when we cease shopping, looking around and flirting, but it's actually beginning to be on the path without sidetracks. And this is also what we do when we begin to become a meditator. And let's see here. So then the next questions are, and I'm not going to summarize the answers anymore, but taking refuge is not going somewhere else, and that's the question. And again, something that has been asked a few times in the context of our webinar: how do you know you're meditating correctly? And finally, there's one: awareness is not necessarily nowness. And as far as that answer goes, then Trungpa Rinpoche here distinguishes between awareness as being aware of the content, whereas nowness as being a more naked experience. Okay. So then he gives some final advice where he encourages the students to please continue practicing. And as we practice, we could do so out of not just saving ourselves, but also out of care for others. As he says, the value of this will be made manifest if you continue to practice. He says, Trungpa Rinpoche says, please, please do it. It's very important. He also says, neurosis is constantly creeping in. The thing is, as we know it, and this is essential to practicing meditation, we need to recognize that we have insanity. And we also need to recognize how this insanity is not something that we needn't blindly subscribe to. But as we recognize this within ourselves, we also want to appreciate that us practicing meditation affects others. We have friends and relatives, and we can choose whether to draw them into a mess with us, or we could be giving them a helping hand. So it's not about winning people over or converting them. That's premature. Like Trungpa Rinpoche says, you have to behave yourself first. But in doing that, then, being there for others, we actually begin with doing a lot of sitting practice so we can gain genuine wisdom. And in that we sit, there's a chain reaction that happens, and we begin to liberate our own insanity, and this actually starts off a process that's very important for this universe and for us and the people around us. So this then concludes the 7th chapter. Let's see here. All right. Okay, someone mentions. Oh yeah. Okay. Well, look, someone here in the forum asked for this article, so I'll include it when I send out the link for the recording. Then somebody's asking, many times we fall into the hope that after practicing we will achieve a certain level. In the most Buddhist texts, they also encourage that we will reach enlightenment after we seriously practice. So we have the expectation, but here Rinpoche is telling us that we should not have such hope. Please clarify it. Well, like I said, we have some apparent paradoxes happening, where we'd want to not have expectation, but we also recognize that what we are doing tastes and feels like the real deal. When we are aware, we naturally can feel how something is a bit freer. We're not necessarily caught by habitual patterns, and so there is some sense that we are going somewhere. So, like we mentioned earlier, with the four qualities of the chariot from the Samadhi-Raj Sutra, we can say we're expecting as someone pregnant. Anyway, in regard to this particular question about the expectation, I'm going to be going through a few things so that might actually clarify that. Could you define the difference between awareness and nowness? I would have thought that they would have to be the same thing in order to cut through the dullness of habitual tendencies. Well, I would like you to please read the Trungpa Rinpoche's what he has to say about that. And basically here we could identify awareness as being aware of what's happening in the mind, and nowness as being a dimension of what we referred to earlier as thatness or that, and something which is not entangled with our centralized experience of what is happening with us. So in this way, nowness is something that is unconditional, and awareness is more conditional in its nature. Through the practice of shamatha vipassana, we become aware of what's happening in our mind, and this we do with awareness and mindfulness, and through that we experience some disentanglement, and that then is what we would call nowness or vipassana. But don't take my word for it. Please look what Trungpa Rinpoche says. It is the end of the study. However, if we have further questions, could we answer via email? Yes, indeed you can. And yes, you have been receiving the links and invitations from my Siddhartha Intent email, and so that is jakob@si.org.au. So please feel free to contact me there. All right. Now I'd like to go on with just going through the sections that that I sent you initially, and I just find them so incredibly profound. The first one here is taken from a work by Trungpa Rinpoche called The Truth of Suffering and the Path of Liberation, and it's an appendix, but it's short guidelines on the meditation. So there's something very important about meditation, is that once we begin to meditate, then we're not really philosophizing anymore. We're not involved in metaphysics. It's about us being present with enlightenment through our awareness. So that dimension of non-confusion already brings enlightenment into the immediate. So that's very important. So we don't really, as meditators, begin to start having a lot to say about meditation or enlightenment. We begin to taste it. And that's where all the, you could say, discussion becomes a bit redundant. So we practice. And as a result, also, we don't have a whole lot of words about a particular attitude towards life, but we just deal with life directly and simply. We don't want to have meditation as something exotic, compartmentalized, and it is something the Buddha designed as something that exists as a key to connect us then with the basic goodness of our life. Meditation is not something that we practice with great opinion. We're not part of a political movement. It's not a statement. It is beginning to learn to be. So in the practice of meditation, we cultivate mindfulness and awareness as a natural part of who we are and as a way of being where we are. When we sit and meditate, there's not something we're looking for or something that needs to be held on to. So again, this is what there was a question before about we sit and meditate and we hope something is going to happen. What we're really doing when we're meditating is we're stopping not being present and we're beginning to be present. So that is what is special about meditation. And being present is there where we can begin to see where it is that we are unenlightened and where it is that we are enlightened. So we're not hoping for enlightenment somewhere else, but we're beginning to experience it. So when we sit and meditate, there's not something we're looking for. There's also not something that needs to be held on to. There's nothing that needs to be sustained. As we sit and practice, we get used to being here. This is familiarizing ourselves in being unproductive, in sitting without having any purpose. Some would call it wasting time. So as we sit, there's nothing happening. This, of course, is hugely different from how we normally do things. Even there, we should begin to suspect that we are doing something that is, say, counter to the habitual. This should indicate that we're doing something, say, valuable. So we're effectively weaning ourselves off this exhausting habit of waiting for something to come. We're try and notice how we're always on to something else, you know. Okay, now we're in a webinar. It's going to last another, 15 minutes? But then what? We're always on to what's next. So what we are looking at is not going anywhere. With this sitting, we are on the path, and also enlightenment is then this path. The goal is here through us sitting. Practically speaking, there are these aspects of meditation. And actually, I'd like, as you're sitting there in front of your computer, your device or whatever, to actually try and sit straight and experience this relationship to our body. The main thing is that we have a straight back. Now, Rinpoche recommends sitting cross-legged, but it is quite common for most practitioners to sit, for many practitioners to sit on chairs. But we do so with a straight but also pliable, not rigid spine. And this should allow the breath and the energy of the body to flow comfortably. So we're not tense, we need to be comfortable, and we need to balance this neither sloppy nor loose or tight. So we can sit cross-legged, and if we sit on a chair, then we don't lean, but we hold ourselves with the lower back. We keep our eyes open, and the gaze is relaxed. We're not focusing on anything in particular. If we find our mind distracted by the visual field, what we're looking at, then this is basically our mind going to the visual consciousness, and what we need to do is just bring our attention back to the breath. Once we get used to this, there's no big deal about seeing whatever it is that's in front of us. So as we then focus on the breath, we exhale, we follow the breath out, as was described earlier. We're not watching it, but we are identifying with it. There's a sense of going out, focus on the breath, and then the gap, like we described in the chapter 2, Recollecting the Present. The in-breath just happens naturally. There's no need to pay particular attention to that. Now, as far as our mind goes, we needn't be too serious or tight. We're not doing something exotic. We're not doing something, you could say, unusual. We are sitting here, we're identifying with the breath, and there's not really any need for too much philosophy or ideas. Even questions that come up, we could experience just questions, uncertainties, they come up, and we just label them thinking and come back to the breath. So when thoughts arise, we don't need to do anything. We just make sure that we're not carried away by them. They generally grab us, and sometimes we can discover that we are drifting for a very long time. This is where we need to have some sense of bringing back. But we also notice how thoughts are such passing, fleeting, fickle phenomena. So we could begin to suspect that we needn't really take them that seriously. So as a general policy as we meditate is that we don't have, or we don't maintain any urge to control or pacify thoughts. We don't make VIPs out of our thoughts. We cease to make a big deal out of them. Now, as we know, meditation is not going to put an end to our problems. It won't end any difficulties. We cannot change the circumstances of our lives or who we are, but we can change the way with which we meet these circumstances. So we're not working on self-improvement. We're not trying to get some insight into deep, profound connections about what's happening around us. It's about simplicity. We are practicing, exercising, becoming simple. So there's nothing particularly profound or mystical or deep. Rather, we're connecting with life with simplicity, and it's something that takes us out of our self-involvement, and it allows for us to expand outward. So this is just touching on this short piece that that I've sent to all of you. And then there is one called 3 Aspects of Meditation. Again, as we're sitting here, if we sit straight, there's something we'd want to see about sitting straight and having posture, because we're not really doing anything particularly Buddhist. And Trungpa Rinpoche somewhere else, as I often quote, he noted how everybody watching a really engaging or exciting movie, they very often sit straight, beautifully, in beautiful meditation position in the cinema. So this thing about posture is something universal. If we have good head and shoulders, we have some dignity. We are a true human being. And Trungpa Rinpoche says it's the opposite of being an ape or a banana. We're not slouching. And particularly we can appreciate this in the juxtaposition to animals, which with all regards and with all respect to animals and extraordinary animals, there is some practice of being very literal in the animal realm. We take things very seriously. We're always looking down and looking what's next. If we look up, it's very often out of fear. So as humans with good head and shoulders, we sit upright and we look up, we look out. Not necessarily out of fear, but out of appreciation. So this is how we'd want to have physical posture. So if you're all sitting there, actually try to do it. Sit straight, shoulders back. Nothing really that spells meditation, but just being properly awake and expressing wakefulness and wholeheartedness with our posture. The next is expectation. So these three aspects, they are posture, which we just covered, then technique, which has two aspects, and then also joy, which has two aspects. So with regards to technique, then again coming back to the question before about expectation, and that is a very important question because we live with that. In the notion of the path, there's a notion of going somewhere, arriving somewhere. But the process, and it's a bit like when we're traveling. Obviously, if we're going on vacation, we travel from A to B. But our vacation is not about arriving. We want to experience every moment of our vacation, every part of our travel. So we're not heading towards somewhere. It's not like when we commute. There's very different ways of traveling. And here particularly, the project of wisdom is contingent on us being properly present. So enlightenment is cultivating lack of expectation, is cultivating this presence. So as we sit, we then would want to be spacious, not being driven by our dramas and anxiety and expectations for something to happen. We sit and we appreciate where we are. We appreciate the space, where we are, whatever it is, without waiting for anything. In that we do that, there's nothing in what we're doing that has something in and of itself. This is of tremendous simplicity. Sitting practice, as Trungpa Rinpoche puts it, is not a punishment or a reward. We shouldn't sit and hope that something is going to happen. The very immersing ourselves in being present is very rewarding. And we'll look at that under the heading of joy. But we need to experience this joy as not something that's dependent on something coming along and gratifying us. So our training is to sit without the hope that meditation is going to provide us with something new. Actually, I think this one here might be wrong. I think technique 2 probably is supposed to be loneliness. So I apologize for that. The heading is mistaken, if I'm not wrong. Anyway, the point of this definitely is about loneliness. So when we sit, we have a sense that we have to do it alone. And this is also where we sometimes hesitate in sitting down. We are not supported. We're not part of some codependent dynamic. We are on our own. And we know that as far as wisdom, awareness, mindfulness, enlightenment goes, nobody's going to do it for us. But also this loneliness has a very definite beauty. Trungpa Rinpoche compares it to playing a bamboo flute. I think we can kind of intuit the quality of a bamboo flute. It doesn't come with a big philharmonic symphony orchestra. It's on its own, but it has that stark, confident quality. So, likewise also, someone strumming a guitar at the foot of a waterfall. And as we sit, there is a lot of vivid sentiments that arise, shocking sentiments. We might, as Trungpa Rinpoche say, become resentful, horny. We might feel like crying, we might feel like laughing, and so forth. But all of these experiences, they arise from and come back to ourselves. There is this sense of immutable, unconditional, not just loneliness, but aloneness. Then there is joy, and we appreciate the quality of sitting as something that is tough, but it's worthwhile. We're doing something. And very often we have satisfaction from hard work. We might be engaging in something that is tough. We could be undertaking a hard work, which might not be particularly pleasurable, but it is something that is giving a sense of reward. For example, we might begin to saw a tree. It's tough, but we just keep going. We might need to take a break every once in a while, but we keep going. Eventually it gets done. So that commitment to, how do you say, pulling through is something that's connected with joy. And then also that the discomfort that we experience is not something we need to resent. It's like bitter medicine. And if you've taken various kinds of medicines, not the sugar-coated variety, you might actually, like myself, lean to the opinion that the worse it tastes, the better it is. But there is this quality of, as it's painful, we also have some sense of its value. So we could actually have a bit of a humor about it. We know it's not gratifying us, but then again, we know it's okay that we're not being gratified. So that kind of sense of humor, they're seeing the polar opposites of one, our wanting pleasure, and the other then the clear sense that we're not being gratified, has a certain comedy, the juxtaposition between these two. And so this aerial perspective, which is, you could say, synonymous with Vipassana, is actually also very much what our sense of humor often is about, that we see the polar opposites and the comedy of these two. So there we join pain and pleasure. So on that note, we draw this study to an end, and I'll just check if there's any more questions, and also then I'll just be speaking about some of the what I do and what we'll be doing next year. All right, there seems to be no questions. That's wonderful. We have achieved what we'd want to with this study, that all doubts have been eliminated. And like someone asked, you are more than welcome to contact me anytime. And also, I should just mention where I'm coming from, which is as a student of Trungpa Rinpoche. I am associated with I serve within what's called Siddhartha's Intent Australia, which is part of Siddhartha's Intent International. And as you know, this is Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche's framework, his organization. And it's, you could say, the Dharma aspect of Rinpoche's activity. Rinpoche also does a lot of other things. He has Khyentse Foundation, which is looking after the practical aspects that need to be there, the practical structure that needs to be there for the Dharma, and also some of his monasteries, or all his monasteries and that whole mandala. And then also he has Lotus Outreach, which looks after vulnerable children and women in various places. So these, of course, are important projects. And within Siddhartha's Intent, then, I work for the Siddhartha Intent branch in Australia, and there we have programs. So if you go to our website, you can see what kind of programs we have. Generally, we have what's called the public format, which we call the Gate of Knowledge, which this is part of. And there's also then what we call a Gate of Practice, which is the Dharma Das. Those who want to practice under Rinpoche's guidance, there is the gradual Dharma path, which is called the Dharma Das. I should, of course, have put all this down on some slide as well, but hadn't actually prepared that. But anyway, I just wanted to say that. So anyway, if you're interested in any of these things, you can always mail me and clarify in regards to that. Then there remains just to say something about the programs next year. Since I was just sitting planning 2015, I thought I would mention what the online studies are going to be. And these include two titles, which is the study of two not very long, rather slim volumes, but very profound. One is then written by Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche's root guru, Shechen Gyaltsab, and it's then taught by Shechen Ramjam Rinpoche. And this text, The Great Medicine, is a text that outlines the Buddhist path and shows us how to, a little bit actually going into what Trungpa Rinpoche says, a little bit the detail of Vipassana, but more in a classical and very clear, structured approach. So you could say the medicine is the remedy for our self-centered attitudes, and is implicitly about developing concern for the well-being of others. But it also, so that is the heart of it, and it covers what we could say the path, the gradual path, how to practically do that. So it's a very complete work that really takes us through the entire journey to enlightenment. And it's also very practically styled, so it's an upadesha or pith instruction. The next one is a classic, which is Padampa Sanjay, who was a great Indian yogi who came and taught in Tibet in the, it was a contemporary of Milarepa, so this would have been 11th century. But there's a time when he visited a village down near the Nepali border called Tingri, and there he gave some advice to the people of Tingri, and this is then known as the 100 verses of advice from Padampa Sanjay. So these are quite not terse, but they're dense, very beautiful and very profound. And so Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, he gives a very lively explanation for each of these verses. So in that, this is something that's particularly aimed towards, you could say, in this case it was some people, some village people, but it also then addresses us who are active people and face all sorts of questions about the path. So this is a very practical pith instruction. So these two title, so then what's coming next year. All right. So just one last look if there are any questions. All right. Somebody says, how could we become Trungpa Rinpoche's students? Well, if you write to me, I can send you some documents about how that's done practically. And other than that, I can just say you're welcome to contact me, and depending on your individual situation, I can possibly help you make contact with Rinpoche and his teaching. All right. Once again, thank you for your interest in the subject matter and for joining me in this study. So with the very best wishes for everyone and your application of these teachings, I'll conclude with a few verses of dedication. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be. Where it has arisen, may it never fail, but ever grow and increase more and more. Thank you very much.